You can have a bad day and go to bed. The sun still comes up every morning. And I really think you can lean into that and look at, each day as a new, fresh opportunity to do something. While I'm a very impatient person, in the home, I'm quite happy to wait to find the perfect piece. It's a space that is warming. It's a space that brings people together. It loves throughout in a way. It sees every emotion. It sees everything.
Hi, Matilda. Not normally this comfortable, so thank you for the lovely setup. I always start with going back to your early life. So I believe you grew up on a National Trust estate, is that right?
Yes.
So tell us about that.
So I grew up in a cottage on the grounds of Up Park, which, is a beautiful National Trust house that was in my family a long time ago, but now is owned by the National Trust. And there was actually a big fire there, huge fire, that burnt most of it down a few weeks after I was born.
Do you mean the main house?
In the main house, yeah.
Oh, wow.
And then my family, along with my cousins, we've all sort of live in cottages around on the grounds.
Okay.
So it was an amazing childhood. It really was the kind of expanse and having cousins all around. I'm actually the youngest in my family by 12 years. So while I have brothers, my childhood was kind of, I was almost like an only child and really left to my own devices, of course, pre-phones and the digital world. So I remember there was a program called Art Attack, and they used to create amazing things. And that kind of was my world. I, kind of was probably a bit of a loner in a way of constantly just kind of being a bit bored and finding ways to fill that gap.
So what do you make of that, growing up in the countryside with a lot of time to yourself in your own head? Did you think that contributed to your creativity?
I think so. I think it's also kind of in my blood, I think.
Tell me about that then.
Well, my grandfather was an artist, and my mother had a kids' clothing company that she ran in the sort of 70s, 80s.
What was that called?
It was called Emma Goad, and she used to have a shop on Beecham Place. Okay. And it was very, definitely not what my kids are dressed in today, but, it was little sailor suits and romper outfits. And so I think creativity is always kind of, it's been a kind of the common thread in my family. I remember fancy dress box, piles of fabric falling out of kind of shoe boxes, rick rack, constantly it was kind of playing around and being creative. And, in lots of different guises, I, used to move my room around the whole time. I then went through a phase of sort of trying to be a bit more handy and, getting tools and bits of wood and being a bit more kind of DT in that sense.
What did you make out of wood?
Oh, I used to make sort of all sorts of things, little houses and shelves and all sorts of things.
That's quite impressive.
Yeah.
I definitely didn't do that. Absolutely terrible with a hammer. So tell me about your mum then. Was she around a lot in your childhood, or was she very busy working?
She was. So she actually gave up her business just after I was born.
Okay.
So she was around all of my childhood. And yeah, kind of one of my real memories as a child is going to antique fairs with her. I remember going around and, she used to buy up. She's always loved chintz and certain types of rugs. And I remember going around, these kind of sports halls in kind of Sussex where there'd be weekend antique markets and stuff, which is now something that I love doing. And we quite often go together to various antique fairs and flea markets.
Nice. And I mean, it seems to me that because my wife Faye grew up in the countryside as well, that there's something about the value of sort of boredom as well. I see that in my own kids because we live in the country as well. But looking back on it, do you think that was quite a good thing for you, that boredom element? I mean, is that the right word even for you?
Yeah, I think it was. At the time, I probably couldn't put my finger on it, but yes, it's that expanse of time. I look at my own children now, bringing them up in a city, and they kind of constantly want to be entertained or go out and do things. It's harder for them to occupy themselves at home here, and you become inventive, and whether that was collecting lavender and making fake potions and trying to sell scent, and that just being and that sense of time you have to fill. You do have to be inventive, I think.
Yeah. So tell us about the house, because was it a deer keeper's cottage?
Yeah, it was an old lodge where my parents still live today, and very, very low ceilings and lots of beams, a kind of bit of a rabbit warren with lots of little rooms, but it's such a feeling of home, and it's got wonderful garden with kind of the old outside loo still exists, which is just a shed, and yeah, it really is, particularly in the summer. I was there over the summer with the apple trees, and it's really just a wonderful place, filled with so much chintz and prints. Yeah.
So they're still there. That's amazing.
Yeah.
So how long have they lived there for?
They've probably been there about 45 years.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
That's very rare, isn't
Yeah.
it? So how does it feel for you going back there now then?
It's wonderful, and my kids love going there. It's not too far from London, so we do go quite a bit. But it's my mother has changed rooms since I lived there. She's also quite like me and quite ruthless at getting rid of things. She doesn't hold on to things, so it's not like my old bedroom exists as it did when I lived there. But it's wonderful, and it holds so many memories, and while I can sort of recognize where a lot of my creativity has come from, it's a very different style to how I am, what I project. I now have this feeling, the room we're sitting in here, that is an extension in my home. I really wanted this sense of having a bit of scale and light and space.
Okay.
Which, in the cottage, there were very small windows and a lot of low ceilings.
That's really interesting. So in some way, you're reacting against that. Yeah, that is interesting. Tell me about your dad then.
So my dad, he worked in property, and I loved going to sites with him. I remember sometimes when he'd exchange on a block of flats, and it needed renovation. I used to love going with him. It was also growing up with changing rooms.
Oh, yeah.
I was all of that. It excited me so much, and my dad has always been very entrepreneurial, and still to this day, he's the person that I get second opinions of things at work. And he taught me to sort of, he always had this motto growing up of like, if a job's worth doing, it's worth doing well. And that's something that, while I feel I used to sort of grunt a lot in my teens about it, it's something that I really recognize in myself now. I don't see the point in doing something half done, not getting a job done. I think if you're going to do something, you've got to do it, finish it, put everything away, rather than,
Yeah.
So I think that and that kind of perseverance of just sort of looking at things slightly in a different way, and finding a solution around things. I think he taught me a lot in a way.
Okay. So it sounds like are you quite a sort of independent spirited person? Is that fair?
Yes.
So if I asked you to describe your character when you were young, let's say 10 years old or thereabouts, and we were a bit of a fly on the wall, what would you have been like? What would you have been doing?
I mean, I think the first thing that came to mind was probably being quite stubborn.
Okay.
I'm very instinctual about stuff, which is a great skill to have when you're designing and you're having to sign off stuff. I really know if something's going to work or not. But as a child, and as I was the youngest by a long way, I sort of was around a lot of adults. I often would be taken, my parents went to dinner parties and I'd be taken along and watch telly in the other room, and I'd stay up and have dinner on holiday with my parents. I wouldn't be put to bed. I was treated like an older child, I guess. So I always had this sort of, I had such a wonderful childhood, but I always just wanted to be older. I wanted that independence, as you said. So very early on, at school, I remember very clearly, I set up a jewelry business selling Bacardi Breezer caps and making them into earrings.
Wow.
So I sold those £3 a pop. I've always had that spirit of wanting to earn money, and whether that was clearing out my parents' garage and doing a car boot sale. So, in my holidays, maybe from the age of 15 or so, on my school holidays, I'd go and hand out leaflets, flyers, do, work wherever I could. I was never very good at sitting still. And I just wanted that idea of, obviously the financial independence of being able to earn a bit of money, but it was more just like I got a glimpse of this bigger world that existed, and I wanted to be there.
What was the thrill there for you? Was it, do you get excited by taking something like a Bacardi Breezer bottle cap and monetizing it? Is it the idea of making something more valuable that gets you going, or what is it about that process that you like?
It's a good question. I think it's seeing an opportunity and being able to monetize it, as you say, but also sharing something that at the time, let me tell you, they were a big hit.
I can imagine, yeah.
I think it's seeing that opportunity and kind of wanting to share it, with that vision. And if I look at that, fast forward however many years to when I first designed my scallop lampshade, I came across something where I hadn't seen lampshades created in this way. And I spun it on its head, and, I wanted to share that.
Yeah. It makes a lot of sense, though, actually, with your mum having a shop and then your dad trading property. You're kind of bringing those instincts together, aren't you, actually?
Yeah.
So that makes a lot of sense.
And I think it's also just, I had a great social group at school. I loved school. I wasn't shy to partying. I had a great time being a kid, but I just saw this wider world that existed of being around older people. And that felt much more exciting to me. By the time I'd sort of, particularly my kind of early 20s, where I'd already decided I didn't want to go to university, I wanted to start working. Like, I've always wanted to get out into that world and seize that opportunity. So I left school, and straight away I got a place at Camberwell Art School. I did a foundation course, and I did a year there. Even that, I found it was quite conventional in a sense that we were there wasn't that much structure. But I enjoyed it. I found, it was my first time being in London, just 18 in London, going down to Camberwell. Back then it was great. And I met such an interesting group of people who are still really great friends to this day. And I got a place to go on to art school for, three more years in London. And at that time, I'd been doing a lot of work on the side, some paid, some more work experience. But I literally said yes to everything: stylists, shoots, artists, like helping in studios. And at that time, I was offered a job working for a stylist. And it just felt like that was what I wanted to do. And I went for it. And then I got a job soon after working at Russian Vogue, which is based in London. It was an amazing person at the time. Anna Harvey was running that department. So there were quite a few of the international Vogues in the building behind Vogue House. And I worked there, and then I sort of jumped around. I worked then at a magazine called Wonderland Magazine, and sort of climbed up the ladder there. And then I was offered a job. Well, a job became available working for Venetia Scott, the photographer and stylist. And at that time, working in fashion, I realized I really wanted to step aside from the styling and look at what options there were in photography. But traditionally, photography assistants are male because, it's a lot of heavy load and moving the equipment, and very few photography assistants were females. But with Venetia, she worked, her background was in styling, and she had shoots peppered in, but she had a lighting assistant who came along. So it was literally the dream job. And I got the job and I worked there, I think, for 4 years in total. And really those years with Venetia were like the best training I've ever had. They were so inspirational to, what I do today. Venetia has a very particular eye and worked, we were just us two day to day. I'd go into the darkroom with her. We'd look at the colouring on prints, down to location scouting, going to the prop houses. And, we worked on American Vogue shoots, in all over the world, massive campaigns. And it was such an eye-opener. And really, my work ethic really came into its own there because I was suddenly surrounded by people that it was like this energy that suddenly I'd kind of been wanting and looking for.
Yeah, the word energy is a good one, isn't it? You clearly have a lot of energy, don't you?
I do. I'm definitely a morning person.
Yeah.
I wake up with, and if I wake up early in the morning, I can't go back to sleep because my mind is da-da-da-da-da-da. And then definitely towards the end of the day, my energy levels, I'm not, I can't knock out a pitch in the evening. I'm not one of those night owls.
I get that. I think a lot of us will feel that way as well. So, okay, so what does Matilda look like then when your kind of batteries are running out? What happens in the evening?
I quite like sort of slow evenings. I think I really like to kind of set the house in a certain way. I like to have loads of the lights really dim with just a few lamps on and candles. It's really important for me that.
Why is that?
When you walk into a room in the evening and it's bright light, it feels really, for your sort of circadian rhythm, it feels like completely off.
Yeah.
But also I think it's that leaning into winding down for the evening. I've got quite into sort of rituals in a way, and I like that idea of, how at dawn brings a whole new perspective. You can have rather than writing off a whole week, you can have a bad day and go to bed and you can wake up and, the sun still comes up every morning. And I really think you can lean into that and look at, each day as a new fresh opportunity to do something.
That's very optimistic.
Yeah.
Is that another word you would use for yourself?
Yeah. I mean, my going back to my dad, he is eternally optimistic. To sometimes to an extent where you're like that you've killed it. That's too much. But I think, I think, with where I am today with work, I think you do have to have that optimism. And I think running a company and a team, you have to have that positivity.
So do you sometimes have to sort of like fake it till you make it on that front? If you wake up and you're not really feeling it, but you've got to go and be positive in front of your team, right?
I think so, yeah. And I think there's a lot, in your mindset anyway, where you can reframe how you feel. It's easy to wallow in something. And, suddenly when you look at your problem compared to the expanse of the universe, suddenly it's easy to worry, and I'm prone to worrying. So I've been, really trying to spend time looking at that.
Okay, so what do you do about that then?
I've been doing quite a lot of breath work and just, looking at the bigger picture. And it's, I've been able to reframe it, how I look at it. Because, it is possible to worry about everything and it can take over your life. So I think, it's all in your mindset, and you can reset yourself quite easily by doing, a bit of breath work.
Do you do that at home?
I do, yeah.
So what does that look like? Where will you do it and how will you do it?
So I work with a friend of mine who's a breathwork coach,
Oh, wow.
and my husband actually got me into it, and he will come, maybe once a month, and we'll do more of a larger breathwork session, one-on-one, which can be. Have you ever done it?
Never. I love the sound of it.
You work through your body, and you do this mouth breath, which is unnatural for the body. So suddenly you can bring so much comes to mind, to thought. And your body, you can start sweating, you start shivering, your body sort of, it resets it almost. So that's really interesting as a sort of one-off. But then, just considering your breath throughout the day, and, if there is something that's, been a bit triggering, you can sit for even a minute and just do a box breath, or just follow your breath. And it does really reset you, I think.
So if someone doesn't know what a box breath is, what is that?
So box breath is, if you imagine, so you're breathing in, you're holding it, you're breathing out, and you're holding it.
And each of those 4 things are the same amount of time, are they?
Exactly. So that could be 4, you could breathe in for 4, hold it for 4, breathe out for 4, or that could be more increased, that could be for 6.
Yeah.
But if you imagine it's the square going round.
Yeah. I love that, actually, that you do that with a friend. That's a really nice thing to do. So one of those sessions, how long will that be? How long are you breathing for?
It can sometimes be, about an hour and a half, because,
Wow.
You'll sort of settle to begin with. You'll do maybe the intense breath work for 15 minutes, 20 minutes. And then which you'll be sitting up for, and then you'll lie down and you'll do more of a sort of slower, that's when it feels really good. It's extraordinary. Once you've done that sort of breath work, you can just hold your breath, not breathing in, for, it feels like a massive amount of time. And it's this, you feel so free. I think it's really powerful.
It really is, isn't it? Is there anything else that you do on that front to sort of keep you on an even keel?
I have done a few silent retreats, which are really interesting.
Oh,
wow. I kind of lean a lot on Eastern medicine and having acupuncture regularly. Really, I find can balance me. I feel I have to feel good in myself. So I'm very invested in what I eat and the supplements I take.
Tell us about what you eat then.
Well, I sort of, I eat meat. I eat, dairy if I'm feeling good. But, as soon as I get the sign of a cold, I'll cut out dairy.
Okay.
And, I don't have a particularly strict diet, but I don't, I try not to eat ultra processed food and a lot of sugar. I try to eat a lot of fresh fruit and vegetables. I see, when I travel, I go to India quite a bit to see our suppliers, and I'm eating, delicious food, but I don't eat a lot of fresh fruit and vegetables there. And I instantly, within a few days, I can really feel it. And suddenly everything gets off kilter. I've got a great green powder that I have in water now when I'm in India. And, I've got my crutches and things that I know, like I know that I have to take a sleeping pill on a flight if I'm going to be working the next day on a long haul flight, because I know that if I don't sleep, it's and I think it's just recognizing those red flags.
We're all different on this. I mean, I have my own routines and rituals and things as well, and it's a form of controlling your world so that you feel like you have some power over it, right? Especially when you're really busy, it feels like things are spinning out of control. So for me, if I feel too far out of control, that manifests itself in anxiety, and it's quite physical anxiety. How does it manifest for you? What is it that you feel when you're off kilter? What's going on?
Like you, are sort of quite a physical anxiety in my body, and it's the constantly with work, you're problem solving. There's always a problem, and there's always a solution. And if your mind and you're in the right space, you can action that quickly. You can think clearly. And when I'm in these states of feeling overwhelmed, you know, I can't, my instinct goes and I can't think clearly in that sense. Everything just feels a bit more unattainable, I think.
Yeah, exactly. I often think this, that if you're an energy person, an anxious person, it comes with it a real downside, which is that you can feel overwhelmed, like you're describing. But there's a really big upside to that, which is that anxiety is also a form of fuel. So I think with you having your kind of energy, you must have a lot of output, is as the upside of it. So just tell us a moment about how you got going with your brand, MG and Co. Because that's obviously come from this burning desire, this kind of selling bottle tops to people, this inner energy that you clearly have.
Yeah, sort of rewinding. So I'd been working with Venetia Scott, and you know, really the first 5 years of my career had been deep in fashion. You know, I was calling Prada looks from shoots to go on couriers, and that was the world I knew. And I didn't really know much about the interior world. You know, I'd been immersed in it. My mother has great taste, and I'd been to beautiful houses that I'd appreciated. But it never kind of had occurred to me that I may fall into that space. And I remember one day going with Venetia, as we did, to the prop houses in Acton, up the road from here. And we were trying to find something, a particular bedspread that was going to go in a shoot. And I remember walking into this warehouse and seeing, you know, aisles of different colored telephones and, you know, people from all the film industry go there. And something inside me just clicked. And I realized, you know, wow, like this creativity that I have and I really appreciate, it doesn't just have to be in sort of art or fashion, which sort of growing up at school, and that was all I sort of really knew as a kind of job opportunity. And something really clicked there. And then around that time, I decided that my time in that job had come to an end. And I spent, I think it was probably the next year, just saying yes to jobs. And through the contacts that I'd made in fashion, it was just when sort of tablescaping and events was, you know, and Instagram was all coming together. And I kind of just said yes to jobs. I remember Lulu Little at Sewn got me in, and I styled some tables for, I think she was doing a series of dinners for press. And, you know, I remember going to the Portobello market and buying boxes of pomegranates and putting gold leaf on them and sourcing plates and using her fabrics as a tablecloth. And sort of, I just started playing around in this world. And, you know, I'm really grateful to these people who gave me, you know, these lucky breaks. Penelope Chilvers, the shoe designer, gave me sort of, you know, the contract to do her windows and both her shops, you know, every quarter. And then the events were kind of scaling up a bit, and suddenly, you know, I said yes to a few weddings and these slightly bigger events, which I sort of had gone down this route, and you know, they were great and they looked beautiful, and I loved the process of pulling people together. But I suddenly was like, you know, hang on, this production world, I've gone too far down this road. But I did realize along the way that I loved the process of being given, you know, the sewn fabric and making them into some napkins for the table. And I loved this process of creating something and finding the supplier and having an idea that you draw on paper and ta-da, the product's there. And around that time, I moved in with my boyfriend, my now husband, which was the first person that I'd lived with other than girlfriends. And, you know, I wanted to sort of make his bachelor pad a bit more feminine. And so I sort of was looking around and on the market trying to see what I could buy. And, you know, I used to go to Kempton Market a lot, which I still do, buying lamps and old lamps that I'd get rewired. But I couldn't find a lampshade on the market that, you know, at that time was in my price bracket. So I sort of would stick different braids on fabrics, and I realized there was a complete gap in the market. And also at that time, I questioned why every lampshade I was looking at had this straight bottom.
Okay.
Why does it have to be that way? Why could it not have a scallop or a different shape? And so I set about quite literally typing in lampshade supplier to Google and called every single supplier and got to page 3.5 and came across what is still our lampshade supplier today, who agreed to make a sample.
What did you say? What were you asking them to do?
To make a lampshade with a scallop bottom.
Simple as that.
It was as simple as that, but traditionally a lampshade would have a wire top and a wire base.
Okay.
And so with this construction, it couldn't have a wire base. So most of the people said, "Who are you?" "No, phone down." But it was that persistence. And I kept going because I believed in it. And God knows what that first email was. I think I probably, drew on a bar on a bit of paper, a picture, probably 6 months later, the first sample came. And it was just when Instagram was beginning. And I felt, it was a great time then because you could gain traction quite quickly, which you can't now. And I think I probably ordered 20 of those lampshades. I sold them to friends. I put the money back in and I ordered 60. And it very slowly was like that. But quite quickly, it gained momentum. And, I then branched out and did a few different colors and different sizes. And, I got my first office. I had a little mini, and I used to pack up the lampshades every day to go to the post office on Goulburn Road. And I could only fit probably about 6 of the boxes in my mini. So I had to do multiple trips to the post office every day to drop off the orders. But, almost ignorance is bliss in a way. I didn't know what I was doing, but I knew in my heart what I was doing. I knew how to get there, even though it was maybe a different way to what's on paper. And so, I kind of winged it for those first few years and brought in new products. And then it was really, in 2020, with the lockdown, that the business kind of suddenly it gained a bit more traction.
Okay. You talked about Instagram there. Do you think, would it have been possible without Instagram?
It was, I'd like to say yes. You look at brands prior to that, back in the 90s, 80s, word gets around. I think it would have gathered momentum at a slower pace.
Okay.
I think I like to show things through images, and I really enjoyed the process of styling the lampshades in my flat at the time and showing them in different ways. And it was a really great visual tool to sell the product.
Yeah. And sorry to interrupt, but you just made me think. So obviously, I think we all feel like, well, a lot of us feel like we've got to know you a little bit through Instagram because you're not afraid of sharing your world in that arena. I'm always sort of intrigued by that. How, in terms of how comfortable is that for you, or do you see it as kind of something that you have to do to get where you want to get to with the business?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. It's never been, I think because the way that the brand was set up, and there wasn't a business plan, there wasn't a pot of funds from an investor. It's always been little by little that I guess Instagram kind of became a crutch in a way. And it was, we don't have a separate brand Instagram and a personal Instagram. And it's just, my personal Instagram almost became the brand Instagram. So I think, it's a great way to be able to show things to our customer base, which is, very far reach, to people in Saudi Arabia or the East Coast of America, who wouldn't have fallen upon me had I been selling my lampshades on a market stall. With something that's very visual, I think images are very powerful. And you can show them in your home. I do find the, and I think my style translates, my background initially was in fashion and now it's in interiors. So I love getting dressed. I love buying vintage clothes. My style very much spans across fashion and interiors. So I'm happy to share a certain amount, but and I've noticed recently as the brand has maybe grown up a little bit that I'm a bit more reluctant to share as much as I used to.
Okay.
And I think it's constantly evolving and changing, isn't it? And it's just recognizing that.
Yeah. I know this is a very direct question, but people don't often ask this. But can I ask you about money?
Mm-hmm.
Because the reality of being a small business founder and owner is that it's not always easy on that front. Does what you do make money? I mean, that's a question, really.
Yeah. Well, yeah, and I think it's a great point to bring up because I think people don't talk about money. And I'm really lucky. I've got a group of girlfriends actually that we're 4 of us together. And we live all over London, and I see them more than my friends that live around here because we see each other. We have a dinner every 2 months, and they work within this space and in fashion, and we're so open about money, and separate to the brand for the moment. But if a job comes in on a partnership or something different, we're so direct. How much did this brand pay for this? And we all are very open about it. And I think it is really important to talk about money, because you need to understand, particularly with partnerships and on that sense, what the level is if someone's offering you money and how that sits, because I think one's worth is really important. Going on to the brand, yes, we're in a really lucky position where we have been profitable since day one, and I take a salary. It's always been really important for me to be profitable. We've been very considered in our growth. We currently are 10 people full time in the office. 3 years ago, I think we were 4 people, and initially, it was me and a couple of part-time staff. So it's always, I think because as going back to those first 20 lampshades, and that was the money that was put in, that is the initial pot that sits in our bank today. But that's obviously has grown. It hasn't been anyone else's money. So I've always been very careful of it and very considered. And, I like to think that all of my team are on very, healthy salaries that can support them, the way that they live, and, justifies their skills.
Yeah.
And it's always been, that has been more important than the bigger picture. And I'm in it for the long run.
Yeah.
It's the slow and steady race.
Yeah, slow and steady is good, I think. Refining as you go along, learning what works and what doesn't.
But I think it's really important to talk about it, and it should be a topic that people talk about more in a more open way.
Yeah.
Even people's salaries, and there's somehow this. I think in America they're a lot more open about it.
Sure.
It's quite a British thing.
Yeah.
To or even working with people, creatives. People skirt around talking about the fee and busy selling the creative bit, and it should be more upfront, I think.
Yeah. I mean, the reality is in this environment, it's extremely difficult for every small business and larger businesses as well, of course. But I think that's not said enough, really. Everybody is finding it difficult. Yeah. And that's okay. It's okay to say that.
Yeah.
But I think it's great that, that's exactly the model that we employed with the Modern House, to be honest. It was just very, very slow, organic growth at first. And then after a while, it feels like if you hit a seam, then you can roll with that, but you can't run before you can walk, I think.
Completely. Yeah. We sort of use the analogy of, the tree putting down the roots and, really building. I think you've got to have such a clear idea of your foundation.
Yeah.
And, the brand, not pivoted, but the direction that we've gone on, when I didn't have a supplier base and I was finding the suppliers. You know, we ended up making a lot of pottery because when I was on holiday in Puglia, I came across a great supplier. But, you know, as we build out the team and I've got staff that have, you know, great knowledge, we've really been able to deliver on what we want to do, which is now a lot of hardware and lighting. And we're much clearer on that direction. And yeah, I think it's kind of glamorized in a way, this idea of overnight growth.
Yes.
But, you know, to me, while I'm not an academic, you know, it's instinctual looking at the books and seeing it doesn't feel comfortable for me to go beyond our means.
Yeah, exactly. Let's talk about this place.
Yes.
Your very beautiful home that I feel like, you know, some of us have seen online here and there. And I think it's really interesting to be in here because, of course, the reality is always slightly different to what you see on a screen, actually. And so I've really enjoyed feeling the volumes of the spaces and the materials you've got in here and the colors. I think it's a very, very elegant, beautiful place. And I've actually really enjoyed looking around. So thank you for that. What was it like when you got here? And what's the kind of origin story of how you ended up here?
Well, firstly, thank you. That's very flattering coming from you and all the homes that you've been in. So this home was actually quite a funny story. I was looking to move out. I'd sort of spent most of my 20s living around Portobello, Notting Hill. And I was looking to move to this area, wanting more space. And I had been looking at a lot of different places online. And I came and I was walking around one Saturday morning and I saw a sign outside here for sale. I hadn't seen this house online. And I knocked on the door. And
Brazen.
Yeah. And early in the morning, because I'm an early bird. And the gentleman who lived here came to the door in his dressing gown. And I was like, hi, I'm just looking around. Anyway, he you know, we had a private tour of the house.
Was he the owner or the tenant?
He was the owner.
Oh, right.
He was the owner, and he'd lived here for 35 years.
Oh, wow.
Him and his wife both worked in the theatre, and the corridors down there were lined with every poster of every production they put on. And it was amazing because, you know, it had such character. You know, it hadn't had fake cornices put in. You know, it really had that. It hadn't been touched. So, and it just, I really believe in the feel of a space. I don't know if you do, but I walked in and it just felt kind of interesting and it had a good feeling. The garden, you know, it has this big wall of ivy. So you're not very overlooked, which I really like. And I sort of just had a real gut feeling on it, that it had this great potential.
A reminder that you can watch my house tour with Matilda over on Patreon. She explains why her kitchen worktops are much higher than usual, why her extension has 3 pairs of French doors into the garden instead of the usual bifold doors, and how she's brought the beachside spirit of the Hamptons to a busy London street. Head to patreon.com/homingwithmatt to take a look. And so what was the kind of first step? You know, if you're approaching a project, what do you think? Like, what is it? I want to conjure a feeling, or I start with a particular color or a fabric or what is it?
We were quite limited by budget. So that, you know, meant there were certain constraints. I think it was first working out the layout, and the kitchen was always in the front of the house, which is quite rare in a terraced house. But I love the idea of in here, we were always going to, you know, extend the room a little bit. I love the idea of having this pitch ceiling and it being a really light space. So once we'd sort of cemented that was going to be the layout, it was really maximizing the space to the best of its use. And so we did quite a quick initial building out this room and, you know, putting a bit of rewiring and plumbing. And then, you know, it really was over. You know, it's been a slow evolution here. You know, even in this room, I've just had that ottoman in here with that fabric. And I feel that is the piece that's been missing. The acid yellow, suddenly that's what's missing in this room. I think I mentioned earlier this idea of sort of cooking and adding in, thinking about the sweet and the spice, and, it needs that balance of room.
There's the acid.
I do think homes constantly evolve, and we've done, we did a little bit of a reconfigure when, we moved in here with no children, and I now have two kids, 2 and 5. And, I was completely clueless. Like I had no idea how much mess and chaos and how much stuff kids come with. So we then did a bit of a reconfigure on the first floor. We knocked out 2 tiny, tiny rooms that weren't very useful and sort of opened up the landing to make it a sort of playroom. And that was, we did that maybe 2 years after the initial build. But yeah, in response to, I guess, your question was, the palette, the colors on the walls, I kind of lean towards more neutral colors. I like to think of the canvas as quite a neutral canvas. And then it means it can have layers of, I'm not stuck in a particular era. I'm not afraid to put a sort of IKEA stool next to a design hero from the 50s. And vice versa, putting a kind of Colfax fabric with something that's much more modern. I just really believe you lean into what you love and it will come together. But I think having that natural, that sort of neutral canvas really helps.
Yeah. So where do you get most of your stuff from? Because it seems a real mix, right? But is a lot of it coming from fairs and markets and eBay? And
it sort of is, but it's because, I just think from it's very cost effective. Certainly to find something that has personality in the quality. If you can't afford the high end, it's far better to find something that's secondhand and to recover it or, recondition it than getting something from a high street, supplier that's not very well made. But, that said, it's, there's a bit of everything in this home. I love, I like to fall upon pieces and I like that story that goes with it. So I'm not, while I'm a very impatient person, in the home, I'm quite happy to wait to find the perfect piece.
Okay, that's interesting.
I'm not that fussed that the home isn't perfect. And I think I've really lent into that since having small kids and realizing that, if you're going to have a nice fabric on a sofa and they spill orange juice on it, like, so be it. Like you can't be precious about things. And the home, I'm never going to have really plump cushions in this house.
But you were saying earlier that the kind of freestanding work table that you had in the kitchen broke, right?
Yes.
What happened to it?
It's the kitchen is underneath my bedroom, and so my husband sometimes on the weekends would gives the kids breakfast in here so they can watch telly.
Yeah,
I know it's a bit sloppy. And so he brings it in for them, and they love to sit behind here with their high chairs, having their cereal, watching the TV. So on one of its transportations, the marble cracked in half.
Oh no. But that's the sort of thing that happens,
Completely.
isn't it? And it's interesting that you're just happy to live with that gap for a while.
Yeah.
You're having something made, but it's I think it's
completely. I feel, friends come to me and, they've just moved in somewhere and they're like, oh, but when coming over, but it's not completely done. And, and then they've sort of rush bought quite an expensive bit of furniture that doesn't really work. And then they don't like it. And, it's quite hard to rehouse furniture in that sense. If it's a new piece, it's big and bulky. And it's hard to resell. It's not like a piece of clothing where if you made a bit of a mistake on a dress that you're not going to wear lots, it lives in your cupboard. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. Where do you stand on clutter?
While I love a lot of things, I don't like a lot of stuff. I know that sort of contradicts itself, but I don't like lots of clutter. Pieces have to have a purpose. They've got to have a use. And, I think as far as we go is, the shells we collect on holidays with my kids and the pebbles, if they're all grouped together in a bowl, that, that works. But I'm definitely not going to be someone that has sort of pieces of china lined up. I think they've got to be concise, and they've got to have a use. And I like clear surfaces.
Okay.
You know, I've as I've got older, and you know, particularly since becoming a mum and probably having quite a busy life, I've become very organized, which is a bit of a bone of contention with my husband, who's quite disorganized. You know, I really believe you can learn to be organized, and I think it's something you can train yourself to do.
Go on, how do you do that?
Well, I think it's, you know, just practice, and you know, there's certain aids you have, and I think this idea of objects having a home. I love the idea of like the junk drawer in one's kitchen. You know, the drawer where you have the plasters, the sun cream, the scissors. You know, that idea of, you know, it can be messy in there, but everything lives in there rather than on top of a surface.
Yeah, and you know that's where the plasters are.
Yeah, exactly.
Importantly.
Exactly. I like to know where things live. I think it feels really good when you're efficient, you know?
Yeah. So if I was to come in here and, I don't know, like shift a few things around on your mantelpiece, would you notice that?
Probably not, because I think it was my kids. But no.
Okay, so it's not that level, i.e. it's not
No.
that everything has to be set in the right position.
No, sorry. I think
Yes, I would, yeah.
I think it's more, I don't mind if things are out of joint aesthetically.
Yeah.
But I like to know that, you know, in the top drawer of my desk, I've got the pen that I like to write with.
Yeah. Okay, got it. So tell me about Tom, your husband. How did you guys meet?
We met through his brother, actually.
Okay.
And yeah, it was quite a quick instant. I think we were together for about a year when we got engaged. In hindsight, I was very young.
How old were you then?
I was 26 when I got married.
Okay, that is quite young these days.
But then we had you know, maybe 5 years without kids. So it was interesting. You know, we've got a great dynamic, but yeah, we were young for sure.
Yeah.
But we sort of almost carried on almost dating in those early years of being married.
Got it. Yeah. Okay. What is it about the two of you that works character-wise?
I think he, you know, really lets me be who I am. And, you know, I'm quite expressive and have my certain ways, and he kind of really lets me flourish in that way. He's much more chilled than me and much more calm. So I think you kind of need that balance.
That sounds good. That sounds good. So applying that to your home then, does he have an opinion on it, or does he just leave it to you?
He lets me sort of, he does have certain opinions, and actually, you know, I'm quite particular in certain ways. In this room, he particularly wanted to put in this porthole window, which at the time I couldn't visualize, and I didn't understand why. And actually, I think it's one of the elements that makes this room. And we built the fridge in our kitchen together. I mean, I say together, I gave some initial ideas and he really did that. So, you know, he's a big, a very important clog in the design.
Yeah.
But yeah, sort of lets me develop the ideas, I guess.
But in every household, right, there's certain things that wind us up. Okay, what does he get out of interest? What does he get irritated by or wound up by?
I mean, he probably gets, because he does all the cooking.
Yeah.
And it's probably more me because he's quite messy.
Okay.
You know, I always think there's one person who's messier than the other.
Okay. So you're saying that you spend a lot of time clearing up after him?
Yes. Putting the pens back in those drawers.
Okay. Sounds symbiotic. And then you've got 2 children. So you've got Domino, who's 5, and August, who's 2. What's that been like for you, being a mum? Because it's obviously a seismic shift for all of us, but what's it been like for you?
It's, you know, it's the most wonderful thing that happened to me. I love being a mother so much. It's, you know, my daughter came into the world right in the peak of the first lockdown, just as my business was sort of gaining a bit of momentum, you know. So I've kind of only ever known juggling work and motherhood. With my little boy, I chose to take a bit more time off on maternity leave, because I felt I missed it the first time round. But I really miss work, and I found, while I may complain that I'm spinning plates doing both, I think I need one to complement the other. I think I'm a better mother when I've been stimulated and I've had a really productive day at work. I feel I can give more to my kids than, the days when I was on maternity leave and, they felt quite long. I didn't feel I had that sense of purpose.
Yeah.
And it's amazing. Like, I've just started, my daughter, comes into my office here and there in half terms. And, it's so amazing seeing her come in, and she'll play with the 3D printer and pick up prototypes. And, I think it's amazing to see that example. And, it's wonderful seeing, as the kids get a little bit older, you see how their imagination works. She'll stay up. She's such a night owl. She quite literally goes to bed when I go to bed, because I go to bed really early. And she'll be, will have set up an entire shop and, really creative imagination.
What time do you go to bed then?
Maybe 9:30.
Yeah. Yeah. Has that changed as you've got older?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
Definitely. But, peppered in with, dinners and, they'll stay up late. But if I'm at home, I like to get an early night.
And so you had both kids at home, didn't you?
Yeah.
Home births.
Yeah.
For anyone listening who's thinking about that, do you advocate that idea?
I thought I had the most positive experiences with having both the home births of both my kids born at home. It was something I was always quite interested to explore, but certainly not with my first child. But she was born in early May of 2020. And I kind of realized that, and I had some amazing support around me who gave me the confidence that actually this would be, one of the best options I could have. At that time, you weren't allowed any companion, you weren't allowed anyone in the hospital. Whereas if I was at home, I'd have the team of people, my husband. And, it really shows, like, the home is such a safe place for me. I'd spent, the however many months before of lockdown here. And it feels, it was my safe space, and it felt like the place that I wanted to welcome in my kids. I had the support of the medical teams that were here. I knew that the hospital was 15 minutes away if I needed to go there. And yeah, it was really wonderful. My daughter was born in the sitting room, my son in my bedroom.
And I love the idea that the home can be this starting point to a new life and the backdrop to those really, really important life experiences.
Completely. I think Western medicine is completely amazing as and when you need it. But, if I go for a checkup or a doctor's appointment and I have the bright lights and all of that, instantly I'm sort of needing to do my breath work. And, instantly it kind of throws me. So, those simple comforts. And I think it's, those simple things you can adjust if you have time. Like if you're in a hotel room, I often move things around. Yeah. It's interesting.
From doing this podcast, I was contacted by a consultant neurologist, and he said, wouldn't it be interesting to see if good design can have an impact on people's experiences when they're recovering from brain injury or brain surgery? So we're going to try and do that piece of work together, which I think would be really exciting. But what do you feel about being sensitive to environments, and what environments do you find hard to be in because they kind of trigger you in that way? I mean, hospitals are an obvious one. Are there any other places where you find similar things?
Well, firstly, I think that's amazing.
Yeah.
I think, there's, we've I know that there's like certain recovery centers where as a brand, we've donated certain products for people. And I think 100%, I am sure that your surroundings can help aid, certainly the emotional recovery.
Yeah.
I think that's amazing. In terms of other spaces, I find airports quite overwhelming.
Yeah, me too.
There's just always something about them that is fraught.
Yeah.
And again, that's an interesting one. I wonder why, that they could be toned down in a certain way, couldn't they?
Well, it's funny you say that because I was thinking that on the tube on the way here this morning. And I was thinking about Heathrow Airport. So Terminal 5, which I'm sure you would have travelled through, I actually think, despite being a really big terminal, is one of the most humane ones there is. And I think actually the acoustic design in there is excellent. It's amazing that in that huge space, it's not a very resonant sound. And you don't feel that sense of the sound crashing off hard surfaces and sort of overwhelming you like a wave. Whereas I think there are many other airports, Gatwick, et cetera, that just feel a lot less humane. And I think it's the combination of hard surfaces,
Yeah,
really not very nice artificial lighting,
completely.
often not being able to see out of a window.
Yeah,
Because I think that's very important to be. It's so underrated that. Just give us a window to be able to look out of.
Completely. Yeah.
But when I was talking to Chris Packham, he said that supermarkets he finds really hard, which I was interested by. And he said for him, a lot of it's to do with smell. So if he walks into a supermarket, he gets kind of like fish and meat and dairy and everything in one go. And his senses kind of say, well, that's not all supposed to go together.
Yes, yeah.
So this word identity I've written down here because for you, it seems to me that your home, it's a home and you share it with your husband and your 2 kids, but it's also kind of a calling card and it's part of your identity. So how do you, is that a fair statement? And sort of how do you feel about that?
Yes, I think it is. It's my visual identity.
Yeah.
And, as I referred to earlier, I think it's in the same way as my visual identity with the way that I choose to dress.
Yeah.
I kind of often compare styling a room in the same way as getting dressed. I lean on a lot of basics with what I wear. I love denim and like a white t-shirt, let's say on a normal day, but I have so many handbags and sunglasses and shoes and it's the layers and that's what I feel like in the home is within my home there's a lot of layers, but actually if you take them away it's quite a simple canvas.
Yeah.
And I think it's that idea of that identity can evolve and change. And, in the way that, I lived here for a year without having kids. And, while, it looked the same, there were certain things that were different. And I think that's in the same way with the way you dress.
Yeah. It's really struck me, I think, sort of spending some time with you today that you're someone that you're about momentum and moving forward clearly, and you've clearly got a lot of energy, and you've talked about doing breath work because there's a kind of breathlessness that comes with that type of character, right? So I suppose I'm interested just to probe a bit more with you because I always think it's helpful for other people to understand kind of behind the scenes of the Instagram feed, when the wheels are kind of coming off. What does that look like for you?
So, I found my early 20s quite hard. I had a great time, it was maybe concealed quite a lot by working hard and partying and surrounding myself and being social. In hindsight, I hadn't found my proper home. I'm now got my partner and my family, and I've got a real reason to put down the roots of my home. But that kind of period of, it's always hard, I think, whether it's in your teens or early 20s, that, maybe you don't have that, maybe I didn't have the confidence that I do today to be who I am. You're always slightly looking around at what other people are doing and wondering whether what you're doing is the right thing. And I think it kind of goes hand in hand. Like I kind of needed to prove myself. And I think that's also something that, going back to, finding it hard at school, maybe I've always had to be busy and work hard to prove myself, that while I wasn't getting 100 out of 100 in exams, I could prove myself I can achieve things in a different way. On a day-to-day level at work, I have built myself a team of incredibly talented people who, each play such a huge part in my company. I've got an amazing COO who is, the right brain to my left brain to right brain. A document comes in, I'll open the visual doc, she will open the contract. We're completely different people, but we can read each other. And so I think it's building that support system around you that's been invaluable. And, no doubt we would not be here today without the team. Like, they have played such a huge part. So I think in some respects, it definitely isn't all glamorous. Probably, a good, a handful of times a week, there are some big problems at work, most specifically with production. I wish people knew, just how hard it is to produce something. I think people often think it's a very easy process and, it's an easy job. There's so much hand-holding and so much disappointment, so many letdowns, delivery windows missed, quality control. There's a lot of things, and that can be really disappointing, particularly when, as a team, you're so efficient. But I think you also have to realize that a lot of it is out of your hands. And, as long as, every problem is also solvable, and it's just getting to that solution. But, it's, I find recently, certainly in the last few years, that the creativity window of my day has really been swallowed up.
Yeah.
And it's trying to find those pockets still. And I try to sort of not stress too much about it, and realize that actually often it's when I'm sitting on the tube that an idea comes. I don't necessarily have to be sitting with a sketchbook in front of me and a pen, because, when I think that I'm going to be researching something one day, a problem comes up that we need to sort.
The future of home. You have been here a while now. Do you see yourself being here forever, or do you think there's another chapter for home?
No, definitely I don't see myself being here forever. But I think the next question is, how long will I be here for? And it's a question that's sort of going round and round in my head. I grew up in the countryside, as did my husband. And that pull is really, strong. However, on the contrary, my kids are thriving in London. It's different to what I knew growing up. But, they have a great life. I get to drop them at school and I can cycle to my office in 10 minutes. Everything is a lot more manageable here. So I don't know. Whenever I'm in a new place out of London, I'm always looking at what's around. And so, but it's that idea of evolving. Even the next place I'm in, I don't think I could ever say this is my forever home.
Oh, really?
No, I think
it's too final.
Yeah, it's too final. And I like the idea of, maybe I'd live abroad for a few years. I don't know.
Where would you, if you could pick a country, which one would it be?
I think it would have to be quite close to home. Italy, I love so much.
It was a guess.
I could see myself in Ibiza.
Okay.
I think there's a great expat community there. But like this is all sort of 3 a.m. worries,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Right now I'm in the office 4 days a week. My husband he's on different building sites every day. So it's a one day, but I think there's definitely a few different places ahead.
Mm-hmm.
And, it's back to this idea of evolving. It would be the next place. And, after our kids leave home, somewhere different.
The final question I always ask everyone, which is, I think, a really enlightening one, because this word home has so many different meanings and connotations, I think, from the physical structure that you inhabit to the community that you're a part of to the feeling within yourself. That word home, I think, has multiple meanings to it. So if I were to ask you to summarize the word home and what that word means to you, what would you say?
What really comes to mind is love.
Okay.
It's a space that is warming. It's a space that brings people together. It loves throughout in a way. It sees every emotion. It sees everything. And we also are also great, so grateful to have a roof over our head. And I think it's whatever it is, it's that place that, it's in your heart, I think.
So do you think about home when you're not here?
I do, but I try, and if I'm going away somewhere, more than a night or two, I'll try to bring certain elements of home to where I am.
Okay. Like what?
Well, I'll maybe move the room around a bit. I hate quilts on beds. That's like the first thing I go into a hotel room. They have to go in the cupboard.
Oh, why?
I just think it's a bit gross. And then I'll sort of move things around quite often. I'll put my jewelry in a dish. I'll manage to make it my space, quite obviously my space, quite quickly. If I'm on holiday and there's sun hats, they'll be decorated around.
Cheeky raffia lampshade goes
Totally,
on.
yeah.
I love that. Thank you so much, Matilda. Thanks for your time. Thanks for inviting us in here. It's been really fun.
Well, thank you. It's been wonderful to speak.